Jasmine Crockett didn't yell or interrupt, but in under 5 minutes, she left Kristi Noem speechless, exposed, and unable to defend her own record. There are moments when the air in a room feels like it's holding its breath, when everyone present knows something is about to happen and they're just waiting for it to begin. That was the feeling inside the Dirksen Senate office building last Wednesday morning. Reporters, aides, members of Congress, and camera crews filled the room, yet nobody seemed to move too much. The buzz outside the hearing room had died down the moment Jasmine Crockett stepped through the double doors. Her name had been floating around D.C. all week, not because of drama, but because of something rarer, anticipation. She walked in without fanfare, no big entourage, no dramatic pause, just a steady walk to her seat, a few folders in her hand, and a kind of focus you can't fake. People leaned in as she adjusted the microphone in front of her, flipped open her binder, and quietly looked across the table at Governor Kristi Noem. This wasn't going to be just another hearing. Governor Noem sat upright, a tight smile barely stretched across her face. She had been through these types of appearances before, and she thought she'd come prepared. Her team had briefed her for hours with talking points, pre-approved phrases, and a media coach waiting just outside the room. But it wasn't the media she should have worried about. It was Crockett. Noem gave a short opening statement, touching on state autonomy, leadership in complex times, and the importance of honest dialogue. Crockett didn't interrupt. She barely blinked. She waited, not impatiently, not with forced politeness, but like someone letting the rope extend before yanking it tight. Once Noem finished, the chair gave the floor to Crockett. The tone shifted immediately. She started without a raised voice or dramatic pause. Her tone was level, measured, professional, but firm. Governor Noem, she said, you've spoken about transparency and integrity today. I'd like to ask you about some specific moments where those values seem in question. Noem gave a polite laugh, trying to lighten the moment. Well, I'm happy to clarify anything that seems unclear. That was her first mistake. Crockett's expression didn't change. She just turned a page in her binder. Let's talk about your recent trip to the UAE. Your office claimed it was a private visit, but according to the itinerary you shared with donors the following week, it included meetings with foreign investors and members of their government. Would you still describe that as a private trip? You could hear a pen stop scribbling in the press row. Noem shifted in her seat. It was a personal development trip, not funded by taxpayers. Crockett kept her voice calm. I didn't ask about funding. I asked if it was private. You met with foreign investors. You discussed state-level policy initiatives abroad. That's not private. That's diplomacy without oversight. Noem paused, smiled again, this time thinner. We're in a global economy, Congresswoman. I think it's important that state leaders engage beyond our borders. Crockett nodded slightly but didn't let go. Then you acknowledged that it wasn't a personal vacation. It was official business, correct? Noem blinked. I wouldn't characterize it that way. That's helpful, Crockett said, marking something in her notes. Then, without changing pace, she moved on. In the weeks following that trip, 3 donors who accompanied you maxed out contributions to your political action committee. Do you recall that? Noem opened her mouth, closed it, then answered, I'd have to review the dates. Crockett glanced up. You mean you don't know who gave you the maximum legal donation? Another pause. Not off the top of my head. Crockett leaned back, not smugly, but as if to say, that's all I needed. There was no yelling, no grandstanding, just questions and cracks beginning to show. But Crockett wasn't finished. The next question would hit even harder. By the time she reached her second question, the mood had already shifted. What began as another polished political hearing was unraveling, not in volume, but in weight. People in the room weren't just watching, they were paying attention. Because this wasn't just about one trip or a questionable donation. It was about what happens when 2 very different ideas of leadership collide. Jasmine Crockett didn't come from legacy. She didn't have a political machine behind her when she started out. Born and raised in St. Louis, she worked her way through law school, did public defense work in Texas, and had seen firsthand how slow, grinding, and unfair the system could be. But she never got loud for show. She got loud when it mattered. That made her dangerous in a room like this because she wasn't just reading lines. She understood what she was saying. Her questions didn't come from a script. They came from years of knowing how people dodge responsibility and knowing how to make them stop. Kristi Noem, on the other hand, had been treated like a rising star for years. Photogenic, articulate, with a tough stance on issues that appealed to her base, she leaned hard into ideals like self-reliance and conservative values, and it had worked. But the closer you looked, the more questions started popping up. That was what Crockett was counting on. "Governor Noem," Crockett said, shifting her papers again, "you've spoken about family values and integrity in public service. Can you explain why a political consulting firm tied to your campaign received nearly $600,000 in the last fiscal year despite no visible campaign activity during that time?" Noem frowned, not in anger, but like someone trying to catch up with the conversation. "The firm handles multiple services, not all of which are directly related to the campaign." "So, you're saying those payments were for services outside of campaign-related work?" Crockett asked. "Yes. Communications, messaging, broader strategic consulting," Noem replied. Crockett tapped her pen twice on the table. "Services that benefit you politically. That's a broad interpretation." Crockett gave a polite half-smile, like a lawyer who knows they just got what they needed. "It's your interpretation I'm asking about, Governor." There was a pause, just long enough for the cameras to catch Noem exhaling sharply. This wasn't performance. This was someone being held to account in a way they hadn't expected. The contrast between them was sharp, and not just in style. Crockett's calm, steady voice carried weight because it didn't ask for attention, it commanded it. Meanwhile, Noem's smile grew tighter, her answers more vague. It wasn't just that she didn't have answers. It was that she seemed unsure what game she was even playing anymore. Outside the room, people on social media were already reacting. Clips were being trimmed and posted in real time. One tweet simply said, "Jasmine Crockett is giving a master class on how to dismantle Spin Live." Back inside, Crockett turned another page. "Governor, you recently criticized the Department of Education for federal overreach. Yet, your state received a $12 million grant for school safety programs last year. Do you believe in rejecting federal funds you disagree with?" Noem's tone changed slightly. "Federal funding comes with obligations, but states can still express disagreement with mandates. Did you express disagreement before or after the check cleared?" Silence. A few muffled coughs. Noem shifted again. "I'm not here to debate political philosophy," she said finally. Crockett looked up. "You're here to answer for your record, Governor. And that's not philosophy. That's accountability." The room didn't erupt, but something sharper happened. People froze, not in shock, but because there was nothing to say. It was rare to see someone stand their ground like that in real time and make it look effortless. You could almost feel the collective thought, "This isn't how these hearings usually go." What made it even more jarring was that Crockett didn't gloat. She wasn't smirking. She wasn't trying to go viral. She was just doing the job and doing it in a way that left very little room to breathe for the person on the other side of the table. But the real turning point was still coming, and it would leave even Noem's supporters quiet. By the time the third round of questioning began, Noem was visibly less confident than when she walked in. Her back was still straight, but the lightness in her tone was gone. Her staffers behind her had stopped exchanging glances. Now they were still, watching like everyone else. Crockett adjusted her microphone and leaned slightly forward, not to intimidate, but to close the distance. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words landed because they were built on facts, not flair. Governor, I want to revisit your stance on government accountability. You've publicly criticized the transparency of federal agencies. Correct? I have, Noem replied. And yet, your office recently denied 3 public records requests filed by investigative journalists in PR related to out-of-state contracts signed by your administration. Do you consider that consistent with your public stance? Noem paused for just a second too long. Those requests were denied based on security concerns and ongoing administrative reviews. Crockett didn't blink. Security concerns for public infrastructure contracts. There were complexities involved. Who determines those complexities, Governor? Crockett asked. Our legal team does that assessment. Crockett nodded slowly, then flipped through a printed copy of the denial letter. So, this statement where your office says, and I quote, the documents requested do not serve the public interest, is that your legal team's phrasing, or yours? Noem looked briefly toward her counsel. That language is part of the standardized response process. Standardized, Crockett repeated, meaning it's used often. The room was quiet again, a different kind of quiet now, tense, thoughtful. No shouting, just a subtle kind of pressure that kept building word by word. Noem cleared her throat. Congresswoman, I don't think this is the appropriate venue to discuss active document requests. You made your views on transparency public, Governor, Crockett replied. So, let's discuss them publicly. It was subtle, but Noem's posture shifted. She crossed her arms, a small move, but in a room where every gesture mattered, it spoke volumes. Crockett continued, almost gently. You once said that leadership means never asking others to do what you're not willing to do yourself. So, when the public asks for basic access to government activity, why is the default answer no? Noem didn't respond right away. Is it a matter of principle? Crockett asked again. I've always supported transparency, Noem said finally, but not at the expense of state security or the efficiency of government operations. Crockett looked genuinely curious. Can you give one example where releasing a contract posed a security threat? Noem hesitated again, flipping her papers. I don't have one in front of me. Crockett leaned back in her chair. Thank you. It was that tone, calm, collected, factual, that made her line of questioning feel like precision cuts, not wounds that gushed in the moment, but ones that would sting more and more the longer they were examined. Meanwhile, phones were lighting up across Capitol Hill. On live streams, TikToks, and Twitter threads, clips of the exchange were already making their rounds, but not because Crockett was grandstanding. Quite the opposite, she was surgical. In one clip, you could hear someone whispering, "She's not letting her off the hook." And that was true because Crockett wasn't improvising. She had done her homework so thoroughly, so carefully, that even when Noem tried to pivot, she had nowhere to go. The facts boxed her in. At one point, Noem glanced toward her aides again, but this wasn't something a whisper or a text message could fix. It was about the reality that Crockett wasn't just prepared, she was ready for every answer Noem didn't have. It's hard to describe the kind of discomfort that fills a room when someone powerful realizes they're losing control of the narrative, and there's nothing they can do to stop it. Because Crockett wasn't emotional. She wasn't reactive, and that made every word more piercing. But Crockett hadn't even reached the part that would go down in hearing history. That moment was coming, and there'd be no way to spin it. There's always a turning point when the usual political rhythm breaks, and everyone realizes they're watching something they'll remember later. This was that moment. Jasmine Crockett took a brief pause. She wasn't tired. She was giving the room time to catch up. She looked down at her binder, flipped a page like it was a menu, and then calmly slid a document across the table toward Governor Noem. I'd like to direct your attention to this transcript, Crockett said. It's from a town hall you hosted in Rapid City 2 months ago. Noem glanced down, unsure of where this was going. In that town hall, Crockett continued, you told attendees, and I quote, "We don't accept federal overreach. South Dakota stands independent." Is that correct? Noem nodded. Yes, I stand by that. Great, Crockett said, nodding once. Because 5 days later, your office filed paperwork to secure an additional $3.4 million in federal subsidies tied directly to infrastructure projects regulated by the same federal agency you publicly criticized. A soft gasp could be heard. Someone didn't hide it well enough. Crockett didn't look up. She stayed focused. Was that request made with your knowledge? She asked plainly. Noem blinked. We pursue funding when it benefits the people of South Dakota. Crockett's voice didn't shift. Even if it comes from an agency you call unconstitutional. Noem leaned in. Look, there's a difference between opposing federal control and utilizing resources that our citizens have a right to. Crockett raised an eyebrow. So, when it's convenient, you're willing to compromise your stated principles. I don't see it that way, Noem replied. I know you don't, Crockett said. But the record does. That was it. That one sentence. It didn't shout. It didn't mock. But it landed harder than anything else said so far, not just because it was true, but because it echoed something everyone had seen before, the politician who says one thing on camera and does another behind the curtain. Jasmine didn't flinch. She let the silence stretch. A few chairs creaked. Even the stenographer slowed down. That's how still the room became. Finally, Noem broke the quiet. If you're suggesting I'm being dishonest, I don't need to suggest it, Crockett said calmly. The paper trail does that. People watching live couldn't believe what they were hearing. Social media was already exploding. Hashtags with both their names were trending. And yet, Crockett didn't seem aware of any of it. She was still seated, still composed, and still pressing forward, not to embarrass, but to expose. She tapped another document, this one already highlighted. Now, let's move to public statements about out-of-state hiring practices. You said you've prioritized South Dakotans for state-level appointments. Would you say that's accurate? Yes, Noem said. We always look in-state first. Crockett pulled out another printout. Then could you explain why your most recent economic advisor was recruited from a consulting firm in Scottsdale, Arizona, with no prior connection to South Dakota's economy? Noem opened her mouth, closed it. That hire was made based on expertise, not local experience. Expertise sometimes comes from outside the state, Noem added. Even when you've campaigned on putting your own people first. Crockett asked. That's a gross simplification, Noem replied. No, Crockett said, her tone sharpening just slightly. It's a direct quote from your last campaign ad. The clip of that exchange would later hit 5 million views by midnight. But in the room, you didn't need social media to know something had just happened, because everyone, whether they supported Noem or not, was watching her sit with questions she couldn't answer. And Crockett? She didn't smirk. She didn't lean back in triumph. She just turned the page again, already moving on to the next point, like it was just another name on the list. What made this hearing unforgettable wasn't just the facts. It was the control, the certainty. Crockett had arrived not to perform, but to reveal, and every moment was another step forward. But just when it seemed like it couldn't get any more uncomfortable for Noem, Crockett asked the question that left the room completely silent. Governor Noem, Crockett began, flipping calmly to the last section in her binder, I have one more area I'd like to address. It's about something you said during an interview on KQ radio. Noem sat still, her hands folded tightly in front of her. Her smile was gone now, not replaced by anger, but by something stiffer, more restrained, a kind of quiet bracing. Crockett continued, her voice unwavering. On that program, you stated, and I quote, every dollar spent from the public budget is accounted for. We don't hide behind complicated language or off-the-books accounting like other places. Is that still your view? Yes, Noem said quickly. Absolutely. Crockett nodded. Good. Then help me understand something. She held up a single-page printout. This is a breakdown of discretionary state fund spending from the past fiscal year. According to your budget office, nearly $2.1 million was directed toward what's labeled state security consultation and outreach. Can you clarify what that entails? Noem didn't speak right away. Then, finally, she said, that category includes several contracted services, security evaluations, facility audits, outreach events. Outreach events? Crockett asked. Yes, Noem said. State-sponsored events focused on safety awareness. Crockett tilted her head slightly. Because when my staff looked into those vendors, one name kept coming up, a newly registered LLC in Sioux Falls, Prairie Vista Strategies, with no listed employees, no past state contracts, no digital footprint, and no office. Noem's lips parted as if to respond, but nothing came out. Crockett kept going. The registered agent is a man named Wyatt Fielding. He's also a longtime donor to your campaign. Someone in the gallery coughed, but nobody dared speak. Crockett didn't blink. Can you explain how a political donor with no prior security credentials was awarded a state contract worth over $600,000 for undefined outreach services? Noem finally spoke, slower now. The Department of Public Safety managed that contract. I wasn't involved in the vendor selection. Crockett raised a brow. But the payments were authorized by your office, correct? The payments were processed, Noem said. Authorized, Governor, Crockett pressed. Another pause. Yes. Then, for a second, it was like everything stopped. Crockett said nothing. Noem said nothing. Even the murmur of typing from the stenographer paused. It was a full 10 seconds before anyone moved. That was when Crockett leaned in, not aggressively, but with purpose. Do you understand how this looks to the people watching at home? Noem blinked rapidly. I stand by the integrity of my office. Crockett kept her tone steady. Even when a shell company run by a campaign donor receives a high-value state contract for vague services with no bidding process and no history. I'll review the contract in question, Noem said, quieter now. Crockett closed the folder slowly. You had every opportunity to review it before today. You knew I'd ask. So, I'll ask again. How do you explain it? Noem exhaled sharply, pressing her lips together. I don't have that explanation on hand, she said. There it was, that sentence, that moment, that gap in the defense no one could patch up. The words hung in the air like steam off hot pavement. No one moved. The chair didn't interrupt. The aides didn't whisper. Even the gallery, made up of reporters, interns, and lawyers, just sat, absorbing what had been said. Because what could you say after that? Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't even look satisfied. She simply rested her hands on the table and looked directly at Noem, not angry, not smug, just disappointed. The hearing didn't end there, of course. There were more questions, more speakers, more formalities, but everyone in that room knew the hearing had already peaked. And it wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was just a truth too raw to dodge. Outside the chamber, reporters scrambled to get their segments together. Staffers opened group chats. Political strategists drafted emails before the clip even finished uploading. And online, people didn't wait. The soundbite was everywhere, I don't have that explanation on hand. It echoed, not because it was shocking, but because it was real. But Crockett hadn't just landed a blow. She had exposed something deeper, and the consequences were still taking shape. By late afternoon, the clip had already hit 1 million views. News outlets rushed to slap together headlines. Twitter, Instagram, even Facebook. Every corner of the internet was chewing on the same bite-sized moment from the hearing. Jasmine Crockett, calm as ever, looking Kristi Noem in the eye as the governor admitted, "I don't have that explanation on hand." But what made the clip so powerful wasn't just the words. It was the silence that followed, the stare, the restraint. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't interrupt. She simply waited. And the weight of the silence did all the talking. Someone watching the stream live had captured the moment and clipped it within minutes. It spread like fire in dry brush. "This is how you hold power accountable," the original poster wrote. No hashtags, no fancy caption, just that line and 39 seconds of precision. Cable networks scrambled to catch up. MSNBC played it 3 times in a row on prime time. Fox gave it a different spin, but even there, the hosts had to admit Noem hadn't looked prepared. "She wasn't ready for this kind of questioning," one panelist said, shaking her head. Crockett was in a different league. In classrooms, college students replayed the clip as a case study in nonverbal control. On TikTok, teens who had never watched a hearing before in their lives were lip-syncing Crockett's line, "It's your interpretation I'm asking about, Governor," like it was a scene from a courtroom drama. Back inside the Capitol, things were more complicated. Crockett wasn't celebrating. She left the room quietly, walking down the hallway with just one aide. Reporters tried calling out questions, but she didn't break stride. She didn't need to. Her words were still echoing on every screen. Kristi Noem exited through a side door, flanked by 2 assistants. She didn't say a word. In the days that followed, Crockett would receive thousands of emails, some praising her, some furious, but nearly all acknowledging what had happened. People saw something rare. A leader who didn't resort to spectacle but still commanded the room. The hearing clip was analyzed frame by frame. Body language experts weighed in. A psychologist on a morning show described the moment as a textbook example of composed authority. They called Crockett's delivery low-volume dominance, something even experienced trial attorneys struggled to maintain under pressure. But there was something more, something underneath all the media spin and think pieces. People weren't just reacting to how Crockett handled herself. They were reacting to what it represented, that someone who didn't look, sound, or operate like the political elite had walked into a room built to protect the powerful and calmly cracked it open. And here's the thing, Crockett never raised her hand, never called for order, never played to the camera. She didn't need volume. She brought receipts. And that was louder than any speech. At a diner in Sioux Falls, 2 women in their 60s watched the clip over coffee. "She didn't even blink," one of them said, shaking her head. "Just kept pressing." "She didn't yell either," the other replied. "Made her look stronger." They weren't political junkies. They didn't talk like pundits. But they knew what they saw, someone who did the homework and made the truth uncomfortable. A week earlier, they wouldn't have known Crockett's name. Now they were telling their neighbors about her. Meanwhile, back in Washington, Noem's communications team scrambled to reframe the narrative. Press releases were drafted, talking points rehearsed, but none of it could fully erase the moment, not when it was already burned into the public record, not when people could play it back with a single click. Crockett, for her part, didn't rush to the media. She didn't grandstand. She went back to work. Her schedule didn't change. She had meetings, constituents to answer, and new bills to read. But behind the scenes, her phone never stopped ringing. Colleagues, some allies, some skeptics, reached out. "That was something," one text read. "I've never seen Noem caught off like that." Even those who didn't agree with Crockett's politics were forced to admit it, she hadn't come to throw punches. She came to ask real questions. And when the answers didn't hold up, she let the silence speak for her. But what came next wasn't about clicks or headlines. It was about whether anything would actually change. By Thursday morning, the headlines were starting to shift. At first, it was all about the clash, Crockett versus Noem, brutal grilling on the Hill, viral takedown stuns GOP figure. But now, the focus turned to the substance behind the spectacle. People weren't just reacting to the drama. They were starting to ask questions about the contracts, the inconsistencies, the numbers that didn't add up. And that's exactly what Jasmine Crockett wanted. In the halls of the Capitol, other members of Congress stopped her to talk. Some offered cautious praise. Others simply nodded as they passed, the kind of quiet acknowledgement you only give to someone who just changed the temperature of the room without ever raising their voice. Crockett took the attention in stride. She wasn't new to pushback, and she wasn't here for applause. Her message, both in public and behind closed doors, was always the same: it's not about who talks the loudest. It's about who does the work. And she had done the work. Every document, every quote, every financial breakdown, she had combed through it herself. Her staff offered support, sure, but this line of questioning was hers. Because when she spoke, it wasn't just about holding someone else accountable. It was about showing the public what real preparation looked like. At a private subcommittee lunch the following day, a senator leaned over to her and said, "You're making people nervous." Crockett didn't flinch. Maybe they should be. Meanwhile, Kristi Noem had gone silent. Her usual morning interviews were cancelled. Her press secretary issued a vague statement about clarifying the record in the coming days but offered no corrections, no explanations, no real rebuttal. That vacuum only made things worse. In South Dakota, local news outlets started picking up where Crockett had left off. One investigative piece out of Sioux Falls took a closer look at the Prairie Vista contract and found that the LLC had been created just weeks before the funds were awarded, no office, no online presence, nothing that suggested it had ever operated as a real company. That report didn't mention Crockett. It didn't have to, because Crockett had planted the seed. The rest was growing on its own. Back in Washington, she returned to committee work like it was any other week. She didn't post selfies. She didn't talk to late-night shows. She sat in budget briefings, met with housing advocates, and took calls from constituents, just like always. But one moment kept echoing behind her everywhere she went: "I don't have that explanation on hand." It wasn't just a gotcha line anymore. It had become a symbol of how far some officials will go to avoid transparency, of how rare it is for anyone to press beyond the first layer, and of what happens when someone finally does. In a follow-up interview with a local Dallas news station, Crockett kept her tone measured. "I'm not here to embarrass anybody," she said. "I'm here to make sure people in power can't pretend no one's paying attention, because people are paying attention. They just need someone who's willing to ask the right questions and wait long enough to hear the real answer." It wasn't a soundbite. It was a challenge. Elsewhere, the fallout continued. Several watchdog groups sent formal letters requesting a federal review of the contracts exposed in the hearing. One ethics panel began preparing an internal report on donor-linked appointments in state governments. And a few governors, quietly, carefully, started reviewing their own procurement procedures. Because the message wasn't just directed at Kristi Noem, it was directed at anyone who thought these hearings were for show. Jasmine Crockett had walked into a room where most people expected her to play her part and move along. Instead, she pulled threads connected to real dollars, real names, real decisions made behind closed doors. And now those doors were creaking open. But Crockett's most revealing moment wouldn't come in front of the cameras. It would come in a quiet hallway conversation where the impact finally hit home. Later that evening, long after the cameras had been packed up and the headlines written, the halls of the Capitol grew quiet again. The buzz of the day had faded, replaced by the late hum of maintenance carts and the shuffle of aides trying to catch up on emails. It was in that stillness that Jasmine Crockett found herself walking toward the elevator, binder under one arm, coat folded neatly over the other. She wasn't rushing. There was no one to impress now, just the quiet rhythm of heels on unpolished marble and a head full of thoughts she wasn't yet ready to unpack. As she waited for the elevator, she heard someone call her name. Congresswoman Crockett. She turned. It was Representative Sylvia Boyd from Oregon, a moderate Democrat who rarely made waves and usually kept her opinions guarded. She was known for her cautious tone and middle-road votes, the kind of politician who knew how to survive tough districts by rarely sticking her neck out. Boyd approached, arms crossed, not defensively, but like she was weighing something inside her. "I just wanted to say, what you did in that room today, that was real," Boyd said. Crockett nodded. "Appreciate that." Boyd paused. "You know it's not going to sit well with some of them, right?" Crockett gave the faintest grin. "Has it ever?" That cracked a small smile from Boyd. "Fair." They stood there for a beat, the elevator taking its time. Then Boyd lowered her voice. "I've been in this building for over a decade. I've seen hearings used for ego, for theater, for campaign clips, but today reminded me why we're supposed to have them." Crockett's face softened just a little, not out of pride, but because she understood what was being said between the lines. "It's not personal," she said. "It's the job." Boyd nodded slowly. "Wish more people remembered that." The elevator dinged open behind them. Neither moved. Boyd looked up. "You made her answer. Not dance, not pivot. You made her answer." "Or not answer," Crockett replied, stepping into the elevator. Boyd stayed outside. Either way, people saw it. The doors began to close. For a split second, Crockett gave a slight nod, nothing rehearsed, just an acknowledgement from one public servant to another that yes, maybe something had landed deeper than a headline. The next morning, Crockett's office was flooded with interview requests, morning shows, podcasts, even a few networks that didn't usually give her airtime were suddenly interested. Her staff filtered them. She turned most of them down, because this wasn't about the moment. It was about the work. But there was one message that did make her pause. It was an email, no subject line, no signature, just a short note from someone back in St. Louis, where she grew up. "Watched you yesterday. Never seen someone like me sit across from someone like her and win. Thank you." Crockett stared at the screen for a long time before replying. "Wasn't trying to win," she wrote back. "Just making sure she had to answer out loud." Back in South Dakota, pressure was mounting. Local journalists had dug up more inconsistencies tied to contracts and donor activity. The state legislature was starting to ask questions they hadn't planned on, and a few of Noem's longtime allies had gone quiet on social media. Even her upcoming speaking engagement in Des Moines was suddenly rescheduled. It was subtle, but the shift had begun, not because Crockett had gone viral, but because she had asked the kinds of questions that couldn't be spun away. And in politics, silence doesn't always mean safety. Sometimes it's the first sign of the ground moving underneath. But for Crockett, the true weight of that hearing would come not from who praised her, but from what she saw when she walked through her district office door the following week. The following week, back in Dallas, Crockett walked into her district office just after 8:30 a.m. Her team was already in motion. Coffee cups on desks, phones ringing, stacks of constituent letters being sorted. But the energy was different. It wasn't chaotic. It was focused, like everyone had quietly decided that the work mattered a little more now. She hung her blazer on the rack near the door and walked past the front desk when her assistant, Lyanna, stopped her. "There's someone here asking to speak with you," she said, glancing toward the waiting room. Crockett turned and saw a young man, maybe in his early 20s, sitting near the window. He was dressed plainly, fidgeting with a baseball cap in his hands. When he looked up and saw her, he stood immediately. "Are you Congresswoman Crockett?" he asked. "I am," she replied. "My name's Tyrell," he said. "I go to El Centro. I just wanted to tell you, I watched the hearing, all of it, twice." Crockett smiled. "Twice?" He laughed nervously. "Yeah. I was going to go into accounting, but now I don't know. I've never seen anyone who looked like you speaking the way you did. You didn't yell. You didn't back down. You just said what needed to be said. And she couldn't say anything back. Crockett paused, then motioned toward a chair. Come sit down. They talked for 10 minutes. He wasn't asking for a job. He didn't want a favor. He just needed to say it out loud, that someone standing up like that made him feel like there was space for him, too. That he didn't need to talk louder or dress differently or change who he was just to be heard. And for Crockett, that was the moment, not the trending clip, not the news hits, not the texts from colleagues or headlines calling her unflinching. It was this one kid sitting across from her saying, "You made me think maybe I can do it, too." Because Crockett never set out to go viral. She didn't need to be the story. Her goal was to shine a light on the things powerful people hide behind. But when you do that, honestly, without performance, without ego, it ripples out in ways you don't expect. Outside, the world was still spinning. News cycles moved on. Other hearings happened. Noem's office issued a bland statement saying they welcomed oversight and were evaluating internal processes. It didn't say much. It wasn't meant to. But the truth had already landed, and it wasn't going away. Crockett's hearing performance was being taught in a few political science classes now. Law professors used the transcript to demonstrate how precision questioning works. But more than that, people were talking about why it worked. Because Crockett didn't come armed with slogans. She came with facts. She didn't try to embarrass someone for applause. She asked questions no one else was willing to put on the record. And when the answers didn't come, she let the silence speak. There's a kind of strength in that, one that doesn't always get celebrated, one that's quiet, steady, resilient. That's the kind of strength young people remember. That's the kind of moment that outlives the headline. A week later, Tyrell sent her office an email. It had just one line: "Switched my major to political science. Don't know where it'll go yet, but now I want to find out." Crockett printed it out and slipped it in the back of her binder, the same one she used during the hearing. She didn't do it to remember the moment she went viral. She did it to remember why she spoke up in the first place. But Crockett knew something else: this wasn't the end. One final hearing was scheduled in 2 weeks, and what came next might carry even more weight than the moment that started it all. 2 weeks later, the same committee reconvened. Different suits, different headlines, but the energy in the room had shifted. Crockett walked in the same way she always did: no entourage, no cameras trailing her, no dramatic pause at the entrance, just a folder in one hand, a phone in the other, and that same quiet resolve. But this time, eyes followed her in a different way, not with curiosity, but with respect. Colleagues who hadn't said a word to her in the last session now nodded as she passed. Staffers straightened their papers. Even a few skeptical reporters lowered their voices, because everyone remembered. They remembered how she made silence feel louder than shouting, how she used facts instead of insults, how she peeled back the polished surface and made someone answer, not for show, not for politics, but for the people watching who'd grown tired of the dodge. The committee chair made a few opening remarks, routine, procedural. Then came the witness introductions. No big names this time, but Crockett wasn't there for names. She was there to finish what she started. Her questions that day weren't flashy. She didn't raise her voice, but the rhythm was the same: precise, direct, undeniable. The room didn't erupt. It leaned in. That's what made her different. Afterward, one of the senior members of the committee, a man who'd been in office longer than Crockett had practiced law, walked up to her quietly. "You know," he said, "a lot of us had stopped expecting hearings to matter." Crockett just looked at him. "Maybe we should change what we expect." He nodded. No follow-up, just a man forced to rethink what he thought leadership looked like. Outside, the world had already moved on to the next story. But something had stayed behind, in the inboxes of local journalists, in the desks of young law students, in the way a public hearing, something most people ignored, had suddenly become the most watched video on 3 platforms in less than 48 hours. And in the way Kristi Noem still hadn't answered the most basic question of all, why was there no explanation? Because that's what accountability looks like. It doesn't always arrive with flashing lights. Sometimes it walks in quietly, waits its turn, and then starts asking the questions no one else dares to ask. That's what Jasmine Crockett did. She reminded people that public service isn't supposed to be polite theater. It's supposed to be truth-telling, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. And maybe that's the lesson: leadership doesn't mean dodging. It doesn't mean rehearsing talking points until they sound honest. It means facing real questions with real answers. It means remembering who you're supposed to work for, even when it's inconvenient. It means showing up. So, if you're watching this and you've ever felt like the truth doesn't matter anymore, remember this hearing. Remember the silence. Remember the young man who changed his major because he saw someone like him speaking with power without apology. And remember that you don't need a title or a stage to hold someone accountable. You just need to pay attention, ask questions, and refuse to let silence be the final answer. If you found this story meaningful, do yourself and others a favor: subscribe, stay aware, and share this, because moments like this only matter if we keep the pressure on.